In the stillness of a warm Mediterranean night, gentle waves lap against an ancient shore. The moon casts a silver path across the water, illuminating the silhouettes of broken walls and fallen columns along the coast. These silent ruins whisper of a time long ago, when this land was alive with the glow of cities and the voices of many languages. It was an age of bronze and gold, of proud palaces and bustling ports, all connected by the ceaseless journey of ships across the sea. Yet now, only the hushed wind and the distant cry of an owl accompany the crumbling stones, keeping the memories of that world alive. There is a timeless quality to this moment, a feeling that if one listens closely enough, the echoes of history might just rise from the dark. Picture the scene as it once was, not ruins but a thriving harbor under the same soft moonlight. Imagine the faint melodies of lyres and flutes drifting from lamp-lit windows, merchants calling out the prices of tin and olive oil, sailors singing as they unload cargoes of copper ingots and painted pottery. This was the late Bronze Age, a world of kingdoms and commerce, of fragile networks linking far-flung lands. Under the stars, the gentle night belies the vast reach of the powers that be. Egypt, Hatti, the Hittite Empire, Mycenae, Babylon, and more. Their envoys and traders crisscross these waters, forging bonds of exchange and diplomacy, never suspecting how precarious it all truly is. It is easy to feel safe on such a serene night. The air is balmy and carries the scent of cedarwood and spiced wine. In the great palace up the hill, a king might be retiring to his chambers, confident in the tribute received from abroad and the treaties sworn with neighboring realms. In a temple nearby, priests tend sacred fires and whisper prayers to the gods for calm seas and bountiful harvests. The empire's borders seem secure, patrolled by chariots and watchmen. Life moves with a steady rhythm, from the ox-drawn carts creaking down torchlit roads to the fishermen pulling in their nets at dawn's first glow. All seems as it should be in the ordered world that has lasted for centuries. Yet, beneath the surface of this peaceful tableau, small tremors begin to stir. Far beyond the horizon, changes are brewing, subtle shifts in climate that will bring years of drought, whispers of unrest in distant lands, and the slow migration of peoples driven by desperation or ambition. Tonight, however, those troubles are invisible, and the world sleeps in the embrace of an illusion, the belief that tomorrow will be much like today. How could anyone in this age imagine that within a single lifetime nearly every one of these shining citadels would fall, that the great palaces would be abandoned and the roots of trade would collapse into silence? We begin our journey in this gentle darkness, on the eve of a mystery. It is the twilight of the Bronze Age, around the year 1200 BCE. And a profound transformation is on the horizon. In the soft glow of moonlight on water, the stage is set for an unfolding drama, the mystery of the sea peoples and the cataclysm that changed the ancient world. Their story is one of movement and upheaval, of battles and wanderings, recorded in broken clay tablets and carved into temple walls. And though the hour is late and our tone hushed, we will explore this mystery together, slowly and calmly, as if walking through the ruins hand in hand with the past. Relax, and let the sands of time slip softly between your fingers as we delve into the enigma of the late Bronze Age collapse and the role these elusive sea peoples played in it. The tale begins with understanding the world they knew, a world ripe with prosperity and entwined by trade, yet more fragile than anyone of that time could have foreseen. Let us first wander through the golden realms of the late Bronze Age to see what was gained and what was lost when the waves of change finally came ashore. Envision a merchant ship setting sail at dawn from the mouth of the Nile. Its sails catch the morning breeze as it departs Egypt, the land of the pharaohs. On deck are sacks of grain from the fertile Nile floodplains and jars of fragrant Egyptian perfumes and oil. The ship's destination lies to the north, along the Levantine coast. As it glides over calm waters, the crew can see the coastline unfurl in the distance, a string of ports and cities that connect Africa to Asia. The first stop might be at Gaza or Ashkelon, Canaanite cities under Egyptian influence, where traders exchange Egyptian gold and fine linen for local wine and copper from nearby mines. Further along, the ship calls at Byblos, famed for its towering cedar tree. Huge logs of cedar wood, freshly cut from the mountains of Lebanon, wait at the docks to be loaded. These timbers will strengthen palace roofs and ship hulls in far-off land. In return, the Egyptian captain might offer luxury linens and perhaps a papyrus scroll inscribed with hieroglyphs as a gift for a foreign dignitary. Continuing north, the vessel reaches the rich port of Ugarit in Syria. Ugarit is a cosmopolitan hub, a place where merchants from every corner of the Bronze Age world rub shoulders in the busy marketplace. In Ugarit's bazaars, one could find tin from distant mountains of the east, copper ingots from Cyprus, painted pottery from Mycenaean Greece, and glass beads of startling blue crafted in Egyptian workshops. The languages of diplomacy and trade mingle in the air. The sharp syllables of Akkadian, the international language of correspondence, as scribes read out letters between kings, alongside the local tongue of Ugaritic, the lyrical Egyptian language, and perhaps the lilting Greek of an Achaean trader. The king of Ugarit lives in a grand palace not far from the sea, its storied halls lined with clay tablets that record everything from trade accounts to diplomatic letters. He is a vassal to the great king of the Hittites, yet he also corresponds cordially with the pharaoh of Egypt and the king of Elachia, Cyprus. This small kingdom thrives by serving as a link in the chain of commerce, and its people have grown accustomed to exotic goods and ideas arriving with each ship that docks. From Ugarit, our imaginary journey can take us westward across the sea to the island of Cyprus, known then as Elachia. The ship cuts through gentle waves carrying letters and gifts from Ugarit's ruler to the king of Elachia. Cyprus is the beating heart of Bronze Age metallurgy, famed for its abundant copper mine. In the port of Enkomi or Kitchen, colossal ox-hide-shaped copper ingots are stacked high, ready to be transported and alloyed with tin to make bronze weapons and tools. The air here carries the tang of metal and smoke from smelting furnaces. Mycenaean Greeks have a trading outpost on the island as well. Their clay tablets record transactions in Linear B script. Here one might meet a Cretan sailor exchanging olive oil for copper, or a Hittite emissary sent to secure shipments of this precious metal for his distant king. Everyone needs copper, and so everyone comes to Cyprus. It is a crossroads of merchants from Anatolia, Canaan, Egypt, and the Aegean. Sailing further west and then north, we enter the Aegean Sea dotted with islands. The Bronze Age Greeks, the Mycenaeans, dominate these waters. We might land at Crete, once home to the older Minoan civilization and now ruled by Mycenaean Greek lords. The grand palace of Knossos still stands, though by this era it might be in decline, its storied labyrinth and colorful frescoes a testament to a sophisticated culture. From Crete our ship continues to the Greek mainland. Imagine approaching the harbor of Pylos, or the rocky coast near Mycenae. Above the shoreline rise formidable stone citadels, the palaces of the Mycenaean kings, with thick cyclopean walls looming over the landscape. Inside Pylos's palace, scribes are busy recording inventories of oil, grain and chariots on clay tablets. The waning light of evening falls on a bustling courtyard where artisans craft fine ceramics and inlaid bronze swords, and officials prepare offerings for the gods. The Mycenaeans are formidable seafarers in their own right. Their ships ply routes to Asia Minor, Cyprus and Egypt, carrying coveted Mycenaean pottery that has been found as far afield as Syria and even Egypt. In return they import metals, ivory and luxury goods to adorn the palaces and tombs of their warrior kings. Now we travel north and east, up into the interior of Anatolia, to visit the Hittite Empire. Leaving our ship behind, envision a caravan route leading inland from the Mediterranean coast, through rugged hills, reaching the great Hittite capital, Hattusa. It lies beyond the mountains, a sprawling city protected by massive stone gates carved with lions and sphinxes. Here in the highlands of Anatolia, modern Turkey, the great king of Hatti presides over an empire nearly as powerful as Egypt itself. In the royal archive of Hattusa, Scribes in flowing robes press cuneiform script onto damp clay tablets in the Hittite language, and also in Akkadian for foreign correspondence. The shelves of these archives hold diplomatic letters addressed to the pharaohs of Egypt, detailing marriages, treaties, and exchanges of gifts. One such letter might read, "To my brother, the king of Egypt. Thus says the king of Hatti. Thus says the king of Hatti. I send you greetings and may the gods bless you. I send you fine horses and chariots as gifts. In return, send the gold you promised." Indeed, about a generation earlier, the Hittites and Egyptians concluded a famous peace treaty after years of rivalry, sealing it with the marriage of an Egyptian princess to the Hittite king. Now, in the late 13th century BCE, an uneasy balance holds between these great powers, sustained by diplomacy and mutual caution. The Hittite realm extends over much of Anatolia and northern Syria. Vassal states like Ugarit, Karkanish, and other cities send tribute to Hattusa, but enjoy some autonomy in managing local affairs. Along the Aegean coast of Anatolia, beyond the Hittite core, lie independent lands such as Arzawa and Wilusa, perhaps the city known later as Troy. These too are part of the fabric of the Late Bronze Age, tied into the system of trade and warfare. A Mycenaean Greek traveler might know of these places from sailors' tales or the occasional sea voyage, just as an Egyptian scribe might have heard news of the Ahiyawa, the Hittite term that likely refers to Achaean Greeks across the sea. The Hittites had heard of powerful cities and tribes in the west. Everywhere the world is interconnected. Bronze ingots from Cyprus, pottery from Greece, gold from Nubia, tin from distant lands in Central Asia, all circulate from hand to hand. The nobles of Canaan drink from Mycenaean goblets. Hittite princes wear jewelry of Baltic amber traded down through Europe. Egyptian pharaohs ride in chariots built with wood from Syrian forests, and bronze smelted from Cypriot copper. This international trade is the lifeblood of the age. With it comes not only goods but ideas, methods of writing, artistic styles, religious beliefs, and languages spread along these routes. An invention or fashion in one corner of the region can soon appear in another. For example, the light, spoked wheel chariot, perfected in one land, swiftly becomes the military vehicle of choice in many kingdoms. And so, as we stand amid this lively web of commerce and diplomacy, it seems that the Late Bronze Age world is flourishing. After centuries of development, it has reached a high point of cultural and economic achievement. Great kingdoms coexist, if not always peacefully, then at least in a state of relative equilibrium. They have known war but also know the value of alliance. They have built cities of splendor, ornate palaces at Mycenae and Pylos, mighty fortresses in Anatolia, elegant temples in Thebes and Luxor, and bustling ports like Ugarit and Sidon. Scribes and artisans, farmers and soldiers all have their roles in sustaining this civilized order. To the people living then, it must have felt that the world was firmly set in its ways, under the watch of benevolent gods and heroic kings. Yet even now, as we admire this tableau of prosperity, one can sense how interdependent it all is, and therefore how fragile. The kingdoms rely on each other for vital resources. A bad harvest in one land can send shockwaves through another that depends on imported grain. A disruption in the supply of copper or tin can leave armies without new weapons. The very fabric that binds these societies, those trade routes and diplomatic ties, can also transmit disaster. Trouble in one corner of the world can quickly become everyone's problem. If the chain of exchange snaps, if the envoys cease to arrive, if the ships stop sailing, what then? For now, the system holds, and life goes on in a golden rhythm. But the stage is quietly being set for a series of events that will reveal just how delicate this balance truly was. So we linger a moment more in this age of shining bronze, knowing what the people of the time did not, that change is coming. Perhaps a wise priest in some temple observes unusual omens, a long drought, a comet in the sky, a restlessness among the populace, and feels a faint dread. Perhaps a king has a dream of dark seas and rising winds. These subtle warnings would likely have been dismissed, or misunderstood. After all, the kingdoms have stood for generations. Who could imagine that within a few decades so many would topple? In hindsight, we see the cracks in the edifice, but at the twilight of the 13th century BCE, the future is not yet written. Our journey now carries us toward that future, into the unknown upheaval that will soon sweep across this interconnected world like a sudden storm following a calm evening. We will witness how the familiar order breaks apart, piece by piece, and try to understand the forces, including the enigmatic sea peoples, that brought an end to this chapter of history. The storm of change did not strike all at once. It gathered and broke over the course of several decades around 12. The first signs of strain came in the form of famine and internal strife. In the Hittite Empire, drought years began to crops withered in the fields of Anatolia, and grain became scarce. We hear an echo of this desperation in a letter sent from a Hittite queen to the Pharaoh of Egypt, pleading for shipments of grain to feed her people. Even mighty Hatti was not self-sufficient when the rains failed. As hunger spread, so did unrest. On the frontiers, long hostile tribes sensed weakness. From the north came the Kaskans tribes from the mountains of the Black Sea region, raiding Hittite lands with renewed boldness. In the west, discontent may have flared among vassal states once kept in check by Hittite might. The great king in Hattusa found his grasp slipping, and then seemingly suddenly the Hittite Empire vanishes from the wreck. Archaeologists digging at the ruins of Hattusa have uncovered a layer of destruction, burnt timbers and collapsed walls. The royal archives so carefully kept on clay tablets cease around this time. We can imagine the once great capital in its final moments, the city gates breached by enemies or perhaps thrown open by desperate citizens fleeing, the palaces plundered and set aflame, their glow painting the night sky red. By around 180 BCE, Hattusa was deserted, its stones left to be reclaimed by wind and wild grasses. The lands of the Hittites fragmented into smaller principalities. One of the late Bronze Age's proudest kingdoms was no more. Far to the west, another world was unraveling. The Mycenaean Greek kingdoms dotted across mainland Greece and the Aegean Isles faced their own collapse. For reasons still debated, one by one the fortified palace centers fell. At Pylos on the southwest coast of Greece, a clay tablet baked hard by an intense fire records a snapshot of the final days. A scribe had written a hurried list of men and weapons assigned to guard the coast, as if an attack by sea was imminent. Perhaps strange sails had been spotted on the horizon. We can picture the people of Pylos looking out at a wine-dark sea under troubled skies, anxiously scanning for enemies. Not long after, the palace of Pylos was consumed by flame. Its storerooms and archives were destroyed, preserving only those last-minute clay tablets as testimony to its end. Over the next few decades, other centers, Mycenae itself, Tiryns, Thebes and more, suffered destruction or abandonment. The Great Hall of Mycenae, where kings once feasted and bards sang of heroic deeds, collapsed into rubble. In some places invaders may have stormed through, in others internal rebellions or simply the strain of economic troubles might have led to chaos. Greece's population declined and the secrets of linear B writing were forgotten for centuries to come. What remained were only memories and myths passed down orally, tales of a lost golden age of heroes, perhaps dim recollections of these very events. Along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, in the wealthy port cities of the Levant, calamity also struck. We have a particularly haunting glimpse from Ugarit, the thriving city-state we visited earlier. Ugarit's final hours are recorded in letters that never reached their destination. In one such clay tablet, the king of Ugarit writes in desperation to the king of Elachia, Cyprus, "My father, the enemy's ships have come. They burn my cities and have done evil things in my country. All my warriors and chariots are away in the Hittite lands, and the fleet is in another land. Thus the country is left to defend itself alone." We can feel the panic in his words. His army is absent, perhaps away helping the Hittites, and his own city is largely defenseless. Another message, possibly a reply from a Cypriot ally or a neighboring governor, urges him to stand firm. Ships of the enemy are sighted at sea. Brace yourself, surround your towns with ramparts, bring your troops and chariots inside the walls, and await the enemy with great resolve. It is sound advice, but it likely arrived too late. Ugarit was overwhelmed. When archaeologists uncovered the ruins of that city centuries later, they found these very tablets, still in the kiln, awaiting delivery amidst layers of ash and charred debris. The destruction was total. Ugarit, with all its wealth of culture and commerce, was wiped out around 190 BCE and never rebuilt. The harbor fell silent, its warehouses of goods turned to ruins and its people either killed or scattered.
the devastation did not end with Ugarit. Other coastal cities in the Levant and beyond met similar fates. On the island of Cyprus, which had been so integral to trade, we find cities that were violently destroyed around this time. At Enkomi and other Cypriot towns, walls are toppled and buildings burned. The rich copper stores may have been looted or set ablaze. One can imagine the terror of the inhabitants as unfamiliar warriors swarmed ashore under the cover of darkness, bringing fire and sword to these once peaceful ports. Cyprus's role as the great supplier of copper was suddenly halted. The flow of metal that armed and equipped the Bronze Age kingdoms dried up, further crippling those who depended on it. In Syria and Canaan, cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to blackened husks. The destruction layers at sites like Hazor and Lachish in the southern Levant speak to the widespread nature of the collapse. Even mighty Babylon in distant Mesopotamia was not immune. Around 155 BCE, the Kassite dynasty of Babylon fell, sacked by invaders from the east, the Elamites, marking the end of an era in that land as well. It was as if a great interconnected machine had suddenly ground to a halt, each part failing in succession. Trade routes that had linked continents were severed. The royal courts that had communicated through envoys and letters fell silent. Famine and flight emptied once crowded cities. Across the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean, people were on the move, some fleeing disaster, others perhaps seeking new opportunities amid the chaos. In the aftermath of these upheavals, the world was irrevocably changed. Regions that had been provinces of empires or thriving kingdoms became impoverished or isolated villages. In Greece, centuries of literacy and artistry gave way to a dark age of relative silence. In Anatolia, the Hittite heartland splintered into small states, and new groups, such as the Phrygians, began to establish themselves on former Hittite soil. Along the Levantine coast, new peoples took hold where the old cities had fallen. Among them were the Philistines, the Peleset of Egyptian record, settling in what is now the southern coast of Israel and Gaza, and other sea peoples finding footholds here and there. Egypt, which had long been the dominant power in Canaan, would soon find its grip on those northern territories slipping away, as local populations and newcomers alike formed their own communities from the ashes of empire. Amid this panorama of collapse, one power famously withstood the tempest: Egypt. The new kingdom of Egypt did not fall in 1200 BCE as so many others did, but it was deeply shaken and forever changed. The pharaohs of the time left us dramatic accounts of how they confronted the forces that toppled their neighbors. To understand the sea peoples and their role in this turmoil, we turn now to the shores of Egypt, where battles were fought and recorded in stone. It is on the walls of Egyptian temples and in their papyrus records that the enigmatic names of these sea peoples are preserved, giving us crucial clues about who they might have been. Egypt's records allow us to piece together the story of these invasions from the perspective of the only major civilization that withstood the onslaught. The pharaohs of Egypt, proud and conscious of their legacy, commemorated their victories on temple walls and large stone stelae, giving us a narrative of the conflicts that raged around 1200. During the long reign of Pharaoh Ramesses II, roughly a generation before the Great Collapse, we find the earliest hints of trouble from the sea. Ramesses II, who ruled about 179–1213 BCE, was a mighty warrior king of Egypt's 19th dynasty, known for building grand monuments and for his epic battle against the Hittites at Kadesh. In the records of his reign there is mention of a people called the Shurdan, or Shurdana, who attempted to raid Egypt's Nile Delta shores in the second year of his rule. The inscriptions tell us that Ramesses II decisively defeated these raiders, capturing many of them alive. In a twist that speaks to the pragmatism of the pharaohs, Ramesses II then enlisted these captured Shurdan warriors into his own army. In fact, some Shurdan became part of his personal guard, valued for their martial skills. Egyptian art even depicts these Shurdan guardsmen, identifiable by their distinctive horned helmets and round shields, standing loyally beside the pharaoh's chariot. This event shows that even in the high noon of Egyptian power, bands of seaborne raiders from the north were probing the rich lands of the Nile. Additionally, at the Battle of Kadesh circa 1274 BCE, Egyptian accounts list among the Hittite king's allies certain groups like the Luka and others that scholars suspect might be related to these maritime people. Thus, even before the main collapse, the sea peoples were present as mercenaries and pirates on the fringes of the known world, a sign of the turbulence to come. Under Pharaoh Merneptah, around 1208 BCE, Egypt faced a grave threat not from the usual direction east via Canaan or north via Sinai, but from the west. A Lydian chieftain named Meri led an invasion into the Nile Delta. What makes this invasion particularly noteworthy is that Meri had enlisted the help of a coalition of foreign peoples from the sea. Merneptah's inscriptions, notably on the Great Karnak inscription, describe these allies of the Lydians by name. Among them were the Ekwesh, Shekelesh, Luk, Shurdan and Teresh, unfamiliar names that likely correspond to some of the very sea peoples who would later trouble Ramesses III as well. Merneptah's account is triumphant. Despite being outnumbered, the Egyptian armies crushed the invader. The pharaoh boasts of slaying thousands and scattering the rest like chaff before the wind. The bodies of fallen foes were piled high, and those captured alive were brought back as prisoners. Merneptah, like his father Ramesses II, took pride in this victory, and attributed to the favor of the god Amun and his own martial prowess. The invaders had come hoping to settle in the rich Nile Delta, even bringing their families and herds along under the Lydian leadership, but they met a grim fate in the deserts west of the Nile. This battle in Merneptah's fifth year, around 1208 BCE, is the first clear historical record of the Sea Peoples as a collective threat. Egypt had repelled them for the time being, but it was a sign that large groups of outsiders were on the move.
By Ramesses III's time, he ruled roughly 1186–1155 BCE as the second ruler of Egypt's 20th dynasty. The Late Bronze Age collapse was in full swing. The Hittite Empire had fallen. Cities like Ugarit were already destroyed, and waves of displaced peoples were pressing southwards. Egypt itself had become the final prize for these migratory warriors. Ramesses III fought a series of hard campaigns to keep Egypt safe from the turmoil engulfing the rest of the Near East. Ramesses III's own inscriptions, especially the vivid scenes carved on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu in Thebes, tell the tale. He describes a massive coalition of foreign peoples advancing from the north by land and by sea, cutting a swath of destruction through the eastern Mediterranean. According to Ramesses III, these invaders had already toppled great civilizations in their path. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were on the move and scattered in war. No country could stand before their arms. The inscriptions go on to list the names of these groups: Peliset, Cheker, Shekerish, Denyen, and Weshesh, the enigmatic Sea Peoples Confederation. Ramesses III notes that these peoples had laid waste to Hatti, the land of the Hittites, to Kode, Cilicia, in southern Anatolia, to Carchemish, a major city on the Euphrates, to Arzawa, western Anatolia, and to Elachia, Cyprus. In other words, they had already caused havoc across Asia Minor and the Levant, and now they were approaching Egypt like a tide of war. We can imagine the alarm in the Egyptian court, news arriving that one after another, neighboring lands had fallen to these marauding bands. Egypt stood virtually alone, the last bastion of the old powers. Ramesses III prepared feverishly. He fortified Egypt's frontier in the north, likely stationing troops at strong points in Canaan, the region that is now Israel and Lebanon, and along the routes through Sinai into the Delta. He also readied the Egyptian navy at the mouths of the Nile. The Medinet Habu reliefs depict the climactic encounters. One famous scene shows the Battle of the Delta. On a churning river, the stylized waves carved in stone, Egyptian warships engage enemy vessels. The Sea People's ships, different in design from the Egyptians, are shown crowded with warriors carrying swords and spears. Egyptian archers on shore and on their ships rain arrows down on the invader. In the chaos, some enemy ships capsize. One relief famously shows a ship tipping over, warriors tumbling into the water among broken oars and shields. On the banks of the Nile, more Egyptian troops with drawn bows are firing at any who try to swim ashore. We see the distinctive dress and equipment of these sea peoples in the carvings. Many wear feathered headdresses or helmets, and some sport the horned helmets like the Shurdan, They carry swords and spears, round shields, and some ride in ox-drawn carts. Indeed, other reliefs show those ox-drawn wagons laden with belongings and even women and children, suggesting that this was not just a raiding party but a mass migration. The inscriptions corroborate this, stating that these peoples came with their women and children, their cattle and their goods, as if they intended to settle in the lands they overran. Another battle likely took place on land in the region of Jai, perhaps somewhere in southern Canaan or the Sinai, where Ramesses III's forces also defeated a contingent of the sea peoples trying to advance by land. In all, the Egyptian accounts claim a resounding victory. One passage boasts, "Those who reached my frontier, their seed is no more. Their hearts and souls are finished forever and ever." In other words, Ramesses III wanted posterity to believe he had utterly annihilated them. He had images carved of piles of enemy weapons and of captive sea peoples being presented to the gods, bound in ropes. The pharaoh took great care to record the numbers of enemies slain and captured, as was customary though likely exaggerated, as ancient propagandists often did. There is no doubt, however, that Egypt managed to hold the line against this onslaught. After the battles, Ramesses III did something telling. Rather than simply driving the survivors away, he claims to have settled many of the sea peoples in Egyptian territories, presumably as captive laborers or as foederati allied troops in garrison towns. The Great Papyrus Harris, a huge papyrus that summarizes his reign, states that the pharaoh settled their chiefs in strongholds, bound in my name. Their women and children I took captive. I subdued them and made them like slaves, giving them tasks to work my land. Many historians interpret this as Ramesses III resettling these groups in areas under his control, possibly in southern Canaan, which was under Egyptian influence at that time, as well as in Egypt proper. This policy might have sown the seeds for the emergence of certain peoples in the Levant in subsequent decades. Notably the Philistines, who appear in Canaan in the decades after these events, and are likely the same as the Peliset, that Ramesses. Egypt had survived where others fell, but the cost was high. The wars against the sea peoples and other invaders drained Egypt's treasury and weakened its international standing. The empire that earlier pharaohs had built in Asia, the lands of Canaan and Syria, was largely lost. Egypt would never again control those distant provinces as it once had. After Ramesses III, Egypt itself entered a slow decline, still standing but a shadow of its former glory in terms of power beyond its borders. However, thanks to Egyptian resilience and their scribes' diligence, the memory of the sea peoples was preserved. Carved in stone and penned on papyrus, the tale of these battles has come down to us across more than 3,000 years. They offer a rare contemporary window into the chaos of the late Bronze Age collapse. Now that we have heard Egypt's version of the events, with its litany of strange tribal names and dramatic battle scenes, our next task is to delve into who these sea peoples might actually have been. The Egyptians recorded their names, but not their homelands or motivation. To piece together that puzzle, we must turn to archaeology, linguistic clues, and later historical hints. Each of the named sea peoples carries a story or at least a bundle of theories about where they came from and what became of them. In the calm of our late-night exploration, let us examine each of these groups in turn: the Peliset, Shurden, Shekelesh, Denyen, Cheker, Weshesh, Luka, Turesh, and Ekwesh. By discussing the clues and evidence for each, we'll inch closer to understanding the human dimension of this grand mystery. Were these people invaders, refugees, or some mixture of both? The answers are complex, but each group provides a piece of the puzzle. The Peliset Philistines. The Peliset are perhaps the most identifiable of the sea peoples, as they are almost universally believed to be the people known later as the Philistines. The Egyptians at Medinet Habu depicted Peliset warriors with feathered headdresses and round shields, and Ramesses III's inscriptions imply they were a major component of the invading forces. After their defeat by Ramesses III, many Peliset were settled or settled themselves in southern Canaan. Indeed, within a few decades of those events, the coastal plain of Canaan, roughly today's Gaza and southern Israel, was home to a distinct new culture that archaeologists recognize as Philistine. The Bible remembers the Philistines as one of the chief peoples of that region during the subsequent Iron Age, the time of biblical judges and kings, and even mentions that they came from Kaftor, a term often identified with the Isle of Crete or the general Aegean region. What does archaeology tell us about them? When we excavate Philistine cities like Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gath, we find that around 175, 1150 BC, new styles of pottery appear, so-called Philistine ware, which has clear similarities to styles from the Aegean world. Some of it looks like locally made imitations of Mycenaean Greek pottery. We also find remains of foods that were not common in Canaan before, such as a significant increase in pig bones at some Philistine sites. This hints at different dietary preferences, possibly brought from overseas. Pigs were more commonly eaten in the Aegean world than in the Semitic regions where dietary taboos against pork existed. The architecture and art of early Philistine settlements also show hints of Aegean influence. All this suggests that a group of people from the Aegean lands settled on the Canaanite coast, creating a hybrid culture, part local, part imported. Perhaps the most striking confirmation of the Philistines' foreign origins comes from genetic study. In recent years, scientists were able to extract and analyze ancient DNA from human remains buried at Ashkelon, one of the Philistine cities. They found that the people who lived there in the 12th century BCE, right after the time of Ramesses III, had a component of genetic ancestry that was distinct and traced back to southern Europe. This European signature was not present in the earlier Bronze Age skeletons from the same region, and it faded in later Iron Age skeletons as the Philistines intermarried with local population. What this tells us is that a new population, likely from the Aegean or perhaps other parts of the Mediterranean, arrived in Canaan around the time of the Sea Peoples and mixed with the indigenous Canaanites. Over a few generations, they lost some of their distinctness as they adopted the local language, which was a Canaanite dialect, and many local customs. But certain aspects of their origin, like pottery styles and possibly some distinctive words or names and initially their genetics, mark them as immigrant. Thus the Peliset Philistines are a prime example of how the Sea Peoples phenomenon likely involved not just raiders, but whole communities relocating. Whether they came as conquerors or refugees or a bit of both is still debated. Perhaps they first arrived with force displacing or dominating the local towns, and then settled down to become one of the peoples of the land. By the time of biblical records a couple of centuries later, they are firmly entrenched in 5 city-states, often called the Philistine Pentapolis: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, and have become part of the tapestry of Iron Age people. Their distant origins across the sea, however, were not forgotten, subtly recorded both in Egyptian texts and in the collective memory of the region. The Sherdana. The Sherdan were another prominent group among the Sea Peoples, mentioned in multiple Egyptian accounts from the time of Ramesses II through Merneptah and Ramesses III. They were depicted with horned helmets, carrying round shields and spears. The Sherdan appear in history a bit earlier than some of the others. As noted, Ramesses II fought them in his year 2, and later even employed them as mercenaries. This suggests that the Sherdan had a reputation as fearsome seafarers even before the main wave of the collapse. The origin of their name provides a big clue to their homeland. Many scholars see a connection to the island of Sardinia in the western Mediterranean. The name Sherdan, pronounced something like Sherdana in Egyptian, sounds quite similar to Sardinia. In fact, it's likely that the later name of Sardinia derives from these people. Moreover, Sardinia in the late Bronze Age was home to the Nuragic civilization, known for its distinctive stone tower fortresses, the Nuragi, and impressive bronze craftsmen. Intriguingly, bronze figurines found in Sardinia depict warriors with horned helmets and round shields, uncannily reminiscent of the Sherdan shown by the Egyptians. Based on these clues, some archaeologists have proposed that the Sherdan were indeed connected to the Nuragic people of Sardinia. There is archaeological evidence linking Sardinia to the eastern Mediterranean around this time. For example, bronze objects made in Sardinian, Nuragic style have been discovered at sites in the Levant and on Cyprus, and vice versa. One particularly fascinating find is a piece of Nuragic pottery from around the 12th century BCE, uncovered at a site in Cyprus. It appears that some Sardinian-associated group was active in that region during or after the collapse, either via trade or as part of these migratory movements. If the Sherdan did hail from Sardinia or its vicinity, what were they doing so far from home? One hypothesis is that they might have been acting as pirates or mercenaries,
taking advantage of the chaos as the great empires weakened. Perhaps they were initially drawn into the eastern Mediterranean as soldiers for hire, as Ramesses II's records indicate, and later when famine or turmoil hit their own homeland, groups of them struck out in search of plunder or new land. Another possibility is that they were part of a chain reaction. Disturbances in one part of the Mediterranean, say in Italy or the islands, set people moving, and these movements cascaded outward, eventually reaching the shores of Egypt. After the dust settled, the Sheridan's legacy might live on in the name of Sardinia itself. While direct evidence is still sparse, the convergence of the name, the matching iconography, and those few archaeological crossovers between Sardinia and the East make a compelling case that the Sheridan were indeed connected to the Nuragic civilization. In later centuries, Sardinia was known to the classical world as a land of skilled warriors and unique customs, possibly an echo of the Sheridan's heritage. The Shekelesh are another sea people group whose name hints at a Mediterranean island homeland. Many scholars propose that Shekelesh is related to Siti, or its ancient inhabitants, often called Sicels, or Siculae. In Egyptian inscriptions, the Shekelesh appear as part of Merneptah's campaign, fighting alongside the Libyan. Picture a band of warriors from far across the sea joining with Libyan tribes to attack the Nile Delta, a scenario that suggests they came from the west, since Libya is west of Egypt. If indeed they were from Sicily or nearby, it aligns with the idea that upheavals were not confined to the eastern Mediterranean. Even the central and western Mediterranean experienced transitions around this time. Historical traditions from later times mention new Italic tribes, like the Siculae, moving into Sicily roughly in the early 1st millennium BCE, possibly displacing earlier people. It's tantalizing to think the Shekelesh could be connected to such movements. Perhaps they were forerunners of those Italic migrants, or conversely, the displaced former inhabitants of Sicily, looking for new lands. Concrete evidence for the Shekelesh is hard to pin down. Unlike the Philistines or Sheridan, we don't have specific archaeological sites we can confidently link to the Shekelesh identity. What we have is circumstantial, the name and the context. Shekelesh in Egyptian might have sounded like Sikalesh, or Shekelesh, which is not far from Sicily. The Sicels were indeed a people in eastern Sicily during the early Iron Age. After some historians theorize that the Shekelesh of 100 BCE and the Sicels of a later century were essentially the same people, or at least connected. If this is correct, it suggests that some portion of the Sea peoples were essentially Italic, or Western Mediterranean folks on the move. Possibly they journeyed east as mercenaries, thus being present in Merneptah's battle in Egypt, and later returned westward, or perhaps after being repelled by Merneptah, they eventually settled in Sicily, giving rise to the Sicels in Italian tradition. There is also an intriguing note from Hittite records. They mention a group called the Shekelayo, described as sea raiders in the Mediterranean. Some scholars think this could be the Hittite way of referring to people like the Shekelesh, operating in the Aegean or along the coasts of Anatolia. While not definitive, it adds to the sense that the Shekelesh were considered seafaring troublemakers even by peoples far from Egypt. Ultimately, the Shekelesh story exemplifies how the Sea peoples might have included groups from very far afield, drawn into the common vortex of the late Bronze Age collapse. It reminds us that the entire Mediterranean basin, from Italy and Sardinia to Greece and Turkey, was interconnected, and in a time of crisis, even distant populations could become entangled in the general movement and conflict. The Denian Danans, the Denian were listed by Ramesses III among the invaders, and the name also appears as Danuna in some texts. The similarity of this ethnonym to Danaya, one of the words Homer's epics use for the Greeks, has long intrigued scholars. Could the Denian have been Aegean Greeks? It's quite possible. Let's explore two not mutually exclusive ideas about them. One places them in the Aegean, as Greek Danans, and another situates them in the eastern Mediterranean near Syria, as the Danuna of Cilicia. First, the Aegean Greek angle. In Greek myth and epic poetry, Danans is used as a collective name for the Greeks, particularly those of Argos and the surrounding region. If the Egyptian scribes Denian indeed corresponds to Danans, we might be looking at a group of Greeks who took part in these upheavals. Perhaps they were Mycenaean Greeks, Achaeans from somewhere like Argos, or another mainland kingdom. It's conceivable that as Mycenaean Greece fell apart, Some Greek warriors or whole communities took to the sea to find new homes or booty, effectively becoming sea peoples themselves. They could have joined up with other migrating groups or operated independently. The Denian might represent one such fragment of the Mycenaean diaspora. This is an intriguing thought, that the collapse of Greek palatial society and the sea peoples phenomenon were directly connected, with some Greeks appearing on the stage as both refugees and raiders in foreign lands. Supporting this idea much later in classical times, Greek historians remembered times of migration and turmoil, like the legendary return of the Heraclidae and Dorian migration, happening after the Trojan War era, which roughly coincides with our period. So Greek collective memory might, in a mythologized way, preserve the notion that tribes of Greeks moved around and abroad in this dark age. Now the Eastern Mediterranean angle, some historical inscriptions from a century or two after the collapse, refer to a people called the Danuna or Danunians in the region of Cilicia, southeastern Turkey, near the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean. For instance, in the records of the Assyrian Empire around 900–800 BCE, there is mention of a kingdom of Kua, likely Cilicia, and its people the Danuna. These Danuna could very well be the descendants of the Denian sea peoples, settled in that area. In fact, the city of Adana in modern Turkey retains a name that could be derived from them. Perhaps the Denian Danuna originally lived in that region, Cilicia, and were uprooted by the fall of the Hittites, contributing to the sea peoples' invasions before resettling back in Cilicia later. Or conversely, they might have been one of the migratory groups, who after roaming and fighting, ended up carving out a new territory for themselves in Cilicia. It's worth noting that Cilicia was indeed ravaged and depopulated at the end of the Bronze Age. Hittite records go silent there, but by the Iron Age it had new polities, likely formed by remnants of various peoples. There's even a biblical connection drawn by some, the tribe of Dan in ancient Israel. The Book of Judges hints that the Danites had a maritime origin or connections. Some 19th-century scholars speculated that the Danites of Israel might have been related to the Denian, basically suggesting a group of sea peoples became part of the Israelites. This theory is not widely accepted today, and evidence is thin, but it shows how tantalizing the Denian's identity can be, inviting many interpretations. Whether Greek or Anatolian, or a mix of both, the Denian exemplify the blurring of lines in this tumultuous time. They could have been Greek warriors who joined the fray, or Anatolian people who, in the power vacuum left by the Hittites, set out to find better fortunes. Or perhaps a bit of both, a band of Greeks teaming up with a band of locals, merging into one group identified by Egyptians under a single name. The Tikar. The Tikar are one of the sea peoples known not only from Ramesses III's lists, but also from a remarkable later story that provides a glimpse into their fate. The Egyptian tale of Wenamun, written around 100 BCE, a quasi-historical story, mentions that the city of Dor in what is now northern Israel, on the Mediterranean coast, was ruled by a chief of the Tikar. In this tale, an Egyptian priest named Wenamun travels to the Levant to procure cedar wood and finds that Egyptian authority has waned. At Dor, he deals not with an Egyptian official or a Canaanite king, but with a man named Bedr, the Tikar governor of Dor. This indicates that the Tikar, after the tumult of Ramesses II's time, took possession of at least one significant city in Canaan and established themselves there. Where did the Tikar come from originally? There are a few theories. One suggests they might have hailed from the region of Anatolia or the Aegean. Some have tried to link the name Tikar with the Ticrians, an ancient tribe associated with the region of Troy in later Greek tradition, or with the town of Dor itself, though Dor was a Canaanite name for the city. Another theory posits that they could have come from Crete or another island, given that other sea peoples seem to have island origins. In truth, we don't have a clear record of the Tikar before they appear in Egypt's records and then as rulers of. What's important is that they, like the Philistines, became part of the fabric of the Eastern Mediterranean post-collapse. Archaeologically at Dor, layers from the 12th century BCE do show changes that align with a new group's presence, different pottery, which could correlate with the Tikar takeover. The Tikar highlight how the sea peoples weren't simply destroyers, they were also settlers and builders of new communities. After the battles were over, groups like the Tikar did not vanish. Instead, they integrated into the local landscape of the Levant. Within a relatively short time, an Egyptian traveler, Wenamun, is dealing with them as established authorities in their own city. They likely intermarried with the locals and adopted many Canaanite customs, but they were still recognized as a distinct group for at least a while. Eventually, like the Philistines, the Ticker would have been absorbed into the broader patchwork of Levantine peoples, perhaps into what we later call Phoenicians, or other local identity. But for that window of time we get to see them in action, a foreign sea people tribe carving out a place in a new land. The Weshesh, of all the sea people's names, Weshesh is the most enigmatic. They are mentioned in Ramesses II's inscriptions, but unlike the others we have virtually nothing else to go on. No known artifacts are directly linked to them, and no later texts clearly mention them. They are in essence a mystery wrapped in a single name. Who were the Weshesh? Various speculations exist. Some have attempted to connect the name Weshesh to the name of a region or people in western Anatolia, or perhaps somewhere like Cyprus, but none of these proposals have gained wide acceptance. The Egyptians give no pictorial depictions specific to them, at least none that we can confidently identify as Weshesh, and outside of the context of listing them among the invaders, we have silence. Because of this, the Weshesh often get the least attention in discussions of the sea people. We simply don't know their origin. They could have been a smaller group swept up in the coalition, or perhaps a larger people whose identity we just haven't pinned down in other records. One idea, very tentative, is that Weshesh might relate to the name Aswa, which was a term for a coalition in western Anatolia, and intriguingly the root of Asia as a name. If one imagines an Egyptian scribe hearing Aswa or something similar, it's a stretch but not impossible that it became Weshesh in his rendering. Another guess ties Weshesh to Walusa, the Hittite name for Troy, but that's even more of a stretch linguistically. In truth, we must admit we don't know. The Weshesh remain a reminder of how many pieces of the late Bronze Age collapse puzzle are still missing. They stand for all the unnamed and lesser-known groups that surely were on the move in that era. Not every migration or invasion got recorded on temple walls. Weshesh may represent those others who slipped through the cracks of history. The Luca people are easier to identify because they were known in records even before the time of the sea people. The Luca were essentially the inhabitants of Lycia, a region in southwestern Anatolia, southern Turkey today, along the Mediterranean coast. Hittite documents from the 14th and 13th centuries BCE frequently mention the Luca as a troublesome independent-minded lot on the Hittites' western border. They were notorious for raiding and rebelling, often acting outside the control of any empire. In one instance, a coalition called the Aswa League, potentially in western Anatolia, included the Luca. In another, a contingent of Luca fighters is actually recorded as having fought for the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh against Ramesses II, likely as paid mercenaries or as a vassal contribution. So the Luca were somewhat like the pirates and freebooters of the late Bronze Age, sometimes fighting for a great king if it suited them, other times causing mayhem on their own. When Egyptian inscriptions include the Luca among the sea peoples, it likely refers to these same seafarers from Lycia. Indeed, the letter from the king of Ugarit we discussed earlier contains a desperate line. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? This suggests that Ugarit's fleet was off elsewhere, perhaps dealing with the Luca or trading there at the worst possible time, and it highlights that the Luca were a known maritime power or presence. The Luca, living along a rugged coast dotted with good harbors, would naturally have taken to the sea. As Hittite central power waned, the Luca likely became even more independent, raiding neighboring regions, and possibly joining in larger ventures with other sea peoples. After the Bronze Age collapse, Lycia emerges in the Iron Age as a distinct region, with its own language. Lycian descended from Luwian, which was related to Hittite and culture. The Lycians of later times, mentioned in Greek history and myth. Herodotus speaks of them and Homer lists Lycians like Sarpedon among the Trojan allies, may well be the descendants of those Luca people. Only by then they are settled and somewhat more organized into a federation of cities. It's possible that during the collapse the Luca expanded their reach, maybe participating in the attacks on Cyprus or elsewhere, before resettling back into Lycia when things calmed. The Luca remind us that not all sea peoples were necessarily displaced from far away. Some were local opportunists. For them, the collapse of larger kingdoms was a chance to assert themselves or to plunder freely. They knew their local waters intimately and could dominate them when imperial navies withdrew. They are a piece of the sea people's puzzle that shows the phenomenon wasn't just about new faces in the region.
The Turush are another group whose name provides a possible hint of origin. Scholars have variously connected Turush to names like Turusinoi or Turushish. Let's unpack those. Terracinoi was the name the Greeks later used for the Etruscans of Italy. Herodotus, the Greek historian, relates a story that the Etruscans originated from Lydia in western Anatolia and migrated to Italy due to famine. While that's a legend, some modern scholars have entertained the idea that the Tarish could indeed have been a group that ended up in Italy as the Etruscans or their ancestors. The phonetic similarity of Tarish and Terracinoi Tusian Latin is notable, though not conclusive. If the Tarish were an Anatolian people, say from Lydia or nearby, who took to the sea, one branch of them might have attacked Egypt while another went west to find new land, like Italy. It's an intriguing theory that ties the end of the Bronze Age to the ethnogenesis of classical people. Another connection is to Tarishish, which in the Old Testament is the name of a far-off land reached by sea. Scholars often suspect it refers to Tarsus in Spain or some western Mediterranean place. Could Tarish be the root of Tarish? That's less clear. Tarishish might be unrelated or related to a word for smelting refining metals. So let's not lean on that too much. Some have also thought of Troy, Wilusa, and the surrounding peoples. The fall of Troy around 1180 BCE. Archaeologically, Troy's Seventib was destroyed roughly then coincides with all this. If the Trojan War was a real event tied up in the collapse, which some think it was one local piece of the larger puzzle, then the aftermath might have sent Trojans or their allies fleeing. The name of the region of Troy in Hittite was Tarissa, similar to Troyes, and one Hittite letter mentions a Tarissa and an Alexandru of Wilusa, Alexander of Ilios in Greek tradition. It's speculative, but one could imagine Tarish being a corrupted form of Tarissa, or something related. If so, maybe the Tarish were people of northwest Anatolia, who after the fall of their cities Troy and others during this tumultuous period, joined the Sea Peoples movement. In Egyptian records, Tarish are mentioned by Merneptah and Rameses III, suggesting they were active both times, circa 112 and 1177 BCE. That means they were involved in the earlier Libyan-led raid and the later Grand Coalition. This persistence hints that they were a significant group, not just a one-off band. After Rameses III's defeat of the Sea Peoples, the Tarish name disappears from history, at least under that designation. If some became Etruscans, they reappear under a different guise centuries later. If not, they may have simply assimilated into other populations. The Akwesh, sometimes transcribed as Akwesh or Akawasha, are another group strongly suspected to be Mycenaean Greek in origin. One piece of evidence for this is rather interesting. In Merneptah's account of the battle against the Libyans and their allies, he notes that some of those allies were uncircumcised. Egyptians and many of their neighbors, like Semitic peoples, practiced circumcision in that era, so to them an uncircumcised enemy was notable and marked as other. Among the listed foes, it's often thought that the Akwesh were specifically identified that way. The Greeks, indeed, did not circumcise. This cultural detail gives weight to the theory that the Akwesh were Achaeans, Greek people. Moreover, the word Akwesh sounds a bit like how an Egyptian might approximate Achaeans, which in Homeric Greek would be something like Achaea. If we allow for language and transcription differences, Akwesh is plausibly Achaea or Achaea without the vowels. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing often omitted vowels. If the Akwesh were Achaean Greeks, it means some contingents of Greek warriors or migratory groups found their way as far as Egypt, joining the coalition attacking the Nile Delta around 112. Bands of survivors, be they dislodged warriors, raiders, or desperate migrants, made their way to Libya or the western Nile Delta, linking up with local tribes for an attempted invasion of Egypt. Another scenario is that not all Greeks who left Greece went west or north like the traditional Dorian movement. Some turned southeast to the rich lands of Egypt. In any case, if Akwesh Achaeans, it's a striking example of how the collapse blurred what we might think of as distinct regions, Greeks showing up on Egypt's doorstep. After being defeated by Merneptah, any surviving Akwesh might have retreated, or perhaps later joined in the bigger push that came in Rameses III's time, though by then Egyptians didn't mention Akwesh specifically. Maybe they were subsumed under other names or not present. We don't hear of Akwesh in later records as such. If they were Greeks, they might have returned to the Aegean or settled somewhere along the way. Interestingly, Within a century or two after these events, we start seeing early Greek traders and mercenaries in the Near East. For example, some of the Philistine pottery might even have been made by Greek artisans, and there are Greek names appearing in later Egyptian texts as seafarers. It's possible that some Greek sea peoples who survived carried on as part of these new communities like the Philistines or others, contributing their heritage quietly. In summary, the Ekwesh are likely a fragment of the Greek world colliding with Egypt. This reminds us that the Late Bronze Age collapse wasn't just a Near Eastern event or just a Greek event, it was a circum-Mediterranean phenomenon. The fates of the Mycenaeans and the fates of the Levantine cities and Egypt were entangled. If drought and war ravaged one, people from there moved and affected the others. As we consider each of these groups, Peliset, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Denyen, Chikar, Weshesh, Luka, Taresh, and Ekwesh, a pattern emerged. Many of them seem to have origins in the Aegean or Anatolian sphere, some clearly like the Luka in Lycia, or likely like the Ekwesh in Greece, while others point to the Western Mediterranean, Sardinia for Shurdan, Sicily for Shekelesh, perhaps Italy for Taresh. It appears the Sea Peoples were not a single monolithic tribe or nation, but rather a collage of different groups, each with their own homeland and story, who were caught up in a larger movement. Some might have been fleeing hardships, drought, famine, war in their homelands, while others might have been aggressive opportunists or mercenaries looking for glory and riches. Modern archaeology has increasingly supported the view that these were real migrations of people. The evidence of new pottery styles, architectural changes, and now even genetic data all align with the idea that populations were on the move. The end of the Bronze Age saw not just the fall of kingdoms, but the displacement and mixing of peoples on a scale that hadn't been seen in many centuries. In a way, it was the ancient world's version of a mass migration period, something like the later fall of Rome and the so-called barbarian migrations. But in the Bronze Age context, and just as in those later times, the migrating groups both contributed to destruction and sowed the seeds for new cultures to grow. It's also important to remember that the term Sea Peoples is a modern shorthand. The Egyptians didn't necessarily see all these groups as one alliance, except when they happened to show up together. In fact, the inscriptions suggest the Sea Peoples were a coalition of convenience, banding together in various combinations at different times. Their motivations may not have been identical. One group might have been primarily in search of new territory to settle with their families, while another might have been looking to pillage and return home, and yet another could have been forces hired or coerced by a leader like the Libyan chieftain. However, from the perspective of the great kingdoms being attacked, all these groups coming roughly around the same time felt like a single overwhelming crisis. Hence, in the Egyptian perspective, they were all part of one grand invasion from peoples of the sea and northern country. Now that we have a sense of who the Sea Peoples might have been and where they possibly came from, we can step back and ask the bigger question: why did all this happen? What forces could drive so many different peoples to be on the move and trigger such widespread collapse? This will lead us into the realm of scholarly theories and interpretations, piecing together the environmental, social, and technological factors that created this perfect storm around. With the evidence laid out, the widespread destruction, the inscriptions of battles, the migrations of peoples, we might ask, why did all this happen? What set in motion this chain of events that ended the Bronze Age? Historians and archaeologists have pondered this question for a long time, and multiple, often complementary theories have emerged. It's likely that it was not a single cause but a combination, a perfect storm of calamities and changes that fed into each other. One major factor considered is climate change and drought. Scientific studies of ancient pollen, lake sediments, and tree rings suggest that around the late 13th to early 12th century BC, the eastern Mediterranean experienced a shift to a drier climate. Rainfall decreased sharply in several critical areas, leading to years of drought. We can imagine the impact: harvests failing 2 or 3 years in a row, pastures turning brown, and granaries growing empty. In the Hittite heartland and northern Levant, where agriculture depended on reliable rains, such droughts could have led to famine. Indeed, we have that letter where a Hittite queen, or perhaps it was the widow of the late king, implored the pharaoh of Egypt to send grain, indicating that Hatti was starving. In Ugarit too, there are hints of famine. Drought would not only cause direct hunger, but also weakened the authority of rulers who couldn't provide food or appease the gods for rain and exhaust the common people's resilience. Closely tied to drought is the idea of ensuing famine and social unrest. Even without foreign invaders, a society can collapse if its people are starving and its economic system breaks down. The late Bronze Age kingdoms were complex and centralized. Palaces collected taxes and food, redistributed supplies, and organized large projects. If the food supply dwindled, the system could go into shock. People might abandon their homes in search of better land or rebel against authorities seen as having failed them. Some archaeologists propose that certain destroyed Mycenaean palaces could have been sacked by internal rebels or rival claimants to power. In times of scarcity, regions might also break away. For instance, vassal cities of the Hittites might have seized independence when the imperial army could no longer support or discipline them. The fabric of society, from village headmen up to the great king, might unravel under prolonged stress. This internal dimension is harder to see archaeologically, as a burned palace looks the same whether foreign raiders or local rioters set it ablaze, but it's undoubtedly part of the story. Another potential contributor is earthquakes. The eastern Mediterranean lies along multiple seismic fault lines. Excavators at some collapse-era sites, like parts of Greece, Turkey, and Syria, have found destruction layers that they suspect were caused by earthquakes rather than human attack. Walls collapsed inward, for example, sometimes with people crushed under debris and no clear signs of invasion like arrowheads or weapons. It's conceivable that a series of strong earthquakes, sometimes dubbed an earthquake storm, struck the region in the late 13th, early 12th century BC. A single quake could devastate a city's defenses and infrastructure, making it ripe for later conquest or simply too demoralized to rebuild. Some researchers like to note that sites from Troy down through the Levant all show destruction around the same broad time frame, which could align with a sequence of quakes along the tectonic plate boundary. While this theory can't explain the entire collapse, it might have been one more stressor, nature herself knocking down what humans had built. We also consider foreign invasion and war as a direct cause. In this context, that largely means the Sea Peoples themselves and other groups like the invading tribes in Mesopotamia or the Iranian Plateau. Earlier generations of scholars often singled out the Sea Peoples as the cause of the collapse, marauding bands that went from city to city, burning and pillaging, and that was that. We've seen that the reality is more nuanced. The Sea Peoples were indeed agents of destruction. Ugarit didn't burn itself after all. It was attacked, but they were likely as much consequence as cause. Still, let's weigh their role. Clearly they did topple cities and kingdoms. The fall of coastal cities like Ugarit, Ashkelon or others can be directly attributed to attacks by these outsiders. The final blow to the Hittite capital may have come from northerners or Sea Peoples passing through. The loss of life, the burning of palaces, and the chaos caused by these wars would have accelerated the collapse of those societies. In Greece, there's a long-standing notion of a Dorian invasion. That is, Greek-speaking tribes from the north, Dorians, moved southward around this time, contributing to the end of Mycenaeans. This concept is somewhat parallel to the Sea Peoples. It might not have been an invasion per se, but migrations and conflicts within the Greek world. The Sea Peoples, in effect, were the international version of that phenomenon. People on the move, sometimes clashing violently with established powers. Then there's the concept of systemic collapse, the idea that the very complexity and interdependence of the late Bronze Age made it prone to a cascading failure. The world of 1200 BC was globalized in the sense of interconnected economies and culture. This brought great prosperity when things were good, but it also meant a disturbance in one part could rapidly affect others. For instance, bronze was the lifeblood of armies and tools. Bronze requires copper and tin. Copper was relatively common. Cyprus was a big source, but tin was rare. Some came all the way from Central Asia or perhaps Afghanistan, some from mines in Anatolia or even Europe. If trade routes for tin were cut by war or upheaval, bronze production could stall, meaning no new weapons for armies at a critical time. Similarly, if one big grain-growing region like Egypt or parts of Syria had a poor harvest, it had ripple effects on food security in places that imported grain. The late Bronze Age states also had professional armies and specialists that depended on the palace economy. If the system faltered, these specialists, like chariot warriors, scribes and craftsmen tied to palaces,
lost their livelihoods and perhaps turned to banditry or left to find opportunities elsewhere. Some scholars, like archaeologist and historian Eric Klein and his The Year Civilization Collapsed, argue for this synergy of factors: earthquakes, droughts, rebellions, and sea peoples all interacting in a complex way. Each alone might have been manageable, but together they brought the system to a tipping point from which it could not recover. In truth, multiple factors likely reinforced each other. Imagine a scenario. A series of droughts leads to famine in Anatolia and the Levant, weakening the Hittites and causing unrest. This famine drives some people to migrate, including groups from Anatolia heading south and west, becoming some of the sea peoples. The weakened Hittites can't control their vassals, so cities like Ugarit are left largely to fend for themselves. Ugarit's pleas for help go unanswered, because the Hittites have their own troubles and Egypt is dealing with its own problems. Meanwhile, perhaps an earthquake hits somewhere like Troy or Crete, adding to the sense of a world in chaos. Opportunistic warriors, whether we call them pirates, raiders, or migrants, take advantage of the situation, attacking ships and coastal towns, as evidenced by letters complaining of such attacks. One city's fall leads to the loss of trade for another city, pushing that next city over the edge. And all the while, displaced peoples band together, some ending up at Egypt's border. It truly is a convergence of calamity. Most scholars today see the sea peoples as both a cause and a symptom of the collapse. They were a cause in the sense that their raids and invasions unquestionably destroyed cities and kingdoms. For example, they caused the destruction of Ugarit, which then caused a loss of trade for others, but they were also a symptom. Their very presence in such large numbers was indicative that upheavals elsewhere, like droughts or wars or collapses of other states, had already occurred. They didn't materialize out of nowhere. Something drove these diverse peoples to move. It's a bit like noticing refugees and raiders on the move today. Their movement is a result of problems at home, war, climate, etc. But when they arrive en masse, it can cause new problems in the areas they move into. It's also worth noting that this period marks the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Iron working technology had existed in small pockets earlier but became widespread after the Bronze Age collapse. One reason often given is necessity. With bronze becoming scarce or with trade networks broken, societies turned to iron, which is more abundant locally, even if harder to work without the developed techniques. So out of the collapse came a significant technological shift. In some areas, iron may have given local groups like some sea peoples or others better weaponry, or at least adequate weaponry even without bronze. Some have theorized changes in warfare contributed. The dominance of chariot elites might have been undermined by infantry armed with javelins and iron-tipped weapons. Possibly a factor in battles where sea peoples might have been infantry who could overwhelm chariots in rough terrain or coastal fights. One can also consider broad social changes. The collapse meant the end of the old elite orders. New peoples like the sea peoples themselves and others took center stage in the Iron Age. For instance, out of the rubble emerged new cultures and polities: the Philistines in Canaan, new Aramean tribes in the Levant, Phoenician city-states, rising from the remnants of Canaanite one, new dynasties in a reduced Egypt and in Greece, a gradual regrouping that centuries later would lead to the classical Greek civilization. In a sense, the sea peoples were midwives of that new world, albeit through violent means. So when asking what caused the collapse, we must answer many things interacting in complex ways. Climate change likely primed the pump by creating scarcity. Scarcity led to internal strife and movements of people. Those movements led to conflicts, the sea peoples' attacks among others that directly destroyed cities and trade networks. The fall of those cities and networks led to further scarcity and isolation, which in turn might have forced more people to move or innovate in surprising ways, like using iron or adopting new lifestyle. This multi-causal understanding shows how the sea peoples were both invaders and migrants, both destroyers and also inadvertently creators of new cultural mixes. The scholarly interpretations have evolved from blaming one thing, like solely the sea peoples as invaders, to seeing a web of factors. As new evidence comes to light, like more precise climate data or new archaeological discoveries, we refine this picture. But the broad strokes remain. Around 100 BCE, the Bronze Age world faced a perfect storm, and it broke under the strain. To put it in human terms, imagine being alive in those years. You might experience unpredictable weather that ruins your crop. You hear that the great king, be it the pharaoh or the king of Hatti, or the Wanax of Pylos, has no grain to give out this year. Bandits or raiders become more common on the roads as central authority weakens. Perhaps an earthquake damages your town's wall. Maybe your neighbor, seeing his children hungry, decides to take his family and leave to try his luck elsewhere. Or he joins a band of armed men who talk of the rich cities over the horizon. Meanwhile, foreign merchants no longer arrive with the goods you used to rely on. The world feels like it's closing in. And then one day, a distant column of smoke on the horizon signals that a nearby city is burning. The war has come to you at last. In such a scenario, it's not hard to see the collapse as the result of a long unraveling and a final snap. By exploring climate data, digging into ruins, and decoding ancient texts, scholars continue to refine this story. New discoveries might yet change our understanding or add detail. But as of now, the Late Bronze Age collapse is best understood as a convergence of factors, environmental, social, and technological, that together brought the old era to an end. The Sea Peoples played a starring role in the drama, but they were part of a larger ensemble cast of catastrophe. Now, as our exploration draws to a close, let us return in our minds to the quiet scene where we began. The gentle sound of waves on a moonlit shore, and the ruins of an ancient city resting under the stars. In that tranquility, we can almost sense the ghosts of those turbulent times. One can imagine the silhouettes of ships that once passed by, filled with families seeking refuge or warriors seeking fortune, the Sea Peoples on their uncertain odyssey. We picture a moment, perhaps after all the smoke and chaos, when a new dawn broke over the Mediterranean. The fires had died down, and the survivors, whether native or newcomer, began to rebuild in their own small ways. A Philistine potter in Ashdod mixes clay for a new style of pottery, blending his ancestral techniques with ideas borrowed from local tradition. A former Hittite farmer in Anatolia leads his oxen in tilling a field, planting the seeds of what will be a new season's crop, hoping the rains return. An Egyptian scribe in Thebes copies the tale of Ramesses III's victories onto fresh papyrus, even as he hears news that the world beyond Egypt's borders has changed in ways almost unimaginable. The Late Bronze Age collapse remains in many ways an enduring mystery. Even today, scholars puzzle over the clues, and each new finding, a sunken shipwreck loaded with copper ingots, a deciphered tablet with a last appeal for help, a genetic analysis of ancient bones, illuminates another corner of that dark time. Yet there is also the realization that some questions might never be fully answered. The Sea Peoples, for all we have discussed, still keep some of their secrets. We don't know what they called themselves in their own tongues, or exactly what drove each group from their homeland. We have tantalizing hints, a shard of pottery here, a hint of a name there, a legend that might echo events, but much is lost to time. They appear almost like shadows flickering at the edge of the Bronze Age's light, sometimes stepping into clarity as at Medinet Habu, where we see them in battle, but often slipping back into obscurity. What we do know is that they were human, as all peoples in history, responding to the challenges and opportunities of their era. In an age of famine, they sought fertile land or at least food to feed their children. In an age of disintegrating palace orders, they sought freedom or fortune outside the old constraints. In doing so, they helped bring one world crashing down, but they also inadvertently helped shape the world that came after. The collapse was catastrophic, but it was not the end of civilization in these regions. Rather, it was a transition. Out of it, new cultures and nations eventually emerged. The Iron Age dawned, and with it the ancestors of the societies we later come to know in history. The Phoenicians, who would spread an alphabet and sail to the Atlantic. The Israelites and Arameans, who would form new kingdoms in the Levant. The classical Greeks, who would arise out of the post-Mycenaean darkness after a few centuries. And even Rome and Carthage in the far future owed something to the movements and mixtures of peoples during this time. There is a quiet hopefulness in recognizing that, as devastating as the Late Bronze Age collapse was, human societies did recover, and the Sea Peoples, once feared invaders, settled down. The Philistines, for example, became part of the local milieu and engaged in trade and treaties with their neighbors, and sometimes battles too, as history rarely stays peaceful. Egypt, though never as mighty as before, continued on, its people carrying forward their traditions and eventually merging with new rulers and influences. Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, in the centuries to come. In Anatolia, new states like Phrygia and Lydia arose, showing that after the storm, life resumed in new forms. The enduring mystery of the sea peoples also carries a timeless lesson about human migration in times of crisis. Throughout history, when societies face collapse, whether due to climate, war, or other upheavals, people move. Sometimes this movement leads to conflict with those already in the places they move into. Other times to cultural blending and renewal. Often, we see this pattern not only in 1200 BCE, but in many other eras, the barbarian migrations at the end of the Roman Empire, or migratory waves in more recent centuries during times of famine or war. The Sea Peoples episode is an ancient example of this fundamental aspect of the human story. As you listen to the gentle waves in your imagination now, consider that those same Mediterranean waters that carried the Sea Peoples also, in calmer times, carried merchants and ideas that enriched civilizations. The sea that can bring upheaval can also bring connection. History is full of such dualities. The people we call the Sea Peoples were both destroyers and catalysts for change. They remind us that collapse, while terrifying in its moment, is also a precursor to transformation. In the stillness of this late hour, we honor both the grandeur and the fragility of that lost world. The mighty kings with their chariots and gold could not foresee that their era would end, just as we today cannot be certain of the future of our own world. There is a humbling lesson in the ruins of Bronze Age cities, that even the mightiest of societies can be vulnerable to sudden change. Yet there is also a comforting thought. Even in the face of such collapse, humanity and people found ways to survive, to move, to adapt, and to carry on their stories. The Sea Peoples in their wanderings carried their customs to new places. The survivors of the old societies preserved what knowledge and crafts they could. In the blending of those, new cultures were born. As the night deepens and our journey through the past comes to an end, let the images of that world drift gently through your mind one more time. The lantern lights flickering in a Bronze Age port city before the fall. The silhouette of a Mycenaean ship, heavy with migrants or raiders cutting across the moonlit sea. The distant glow of fires on a hill where a palace once stood. And finally, the sunrise of a new day in about 1100 BCE. Shining down on a changed but still living world. The tale of the Sea Peoples and the late Bronze Age collapse is a story about the resilience of people in motion and the ever-changing tapestry of human civilization. It remains a haunting mystery, inviting us to ponder how interconnected our world was and as we drift into sleep, we might imagine the whisper of the waves and the faint echo of oars, carrying the sorrows and hopes of those long ago people into the silence of the night, reminding us that from great upheaval eventually, calm and renewal will come.